Hello people, welcome back to The Great Everything. I want to talk about my grandmother, and those of you who have listened for a while know this story, but I think it bears repeating. And it bears repeating today in particular, because it's the 26th of January, which means that today and tomorrow are Holocaust Remembrance Day. Today in 1945, the 332nd Rifle Division of the Red Army, I didn't know that just off the top of my head, I googled it. But the Red Army liberated Auschwitz, today in 1945. And Auschwitz is the camp, right? It's the place that is, in a way, it symbolizes the whole Holocaust. It's the real symbol of what happened there. Because think of what was done there, in that place, the way it was done. I just can't think of a single place in all of human history that is more closely synonymous with just evil. It's a monument to evil. And that sadistically ironic motto at the top of the gate, twisted in the iron, work makes you free, Arbeit macht frei. What a cruel joke. That's what you saw as you passed those gates. I mean, at least the gates in Dante's Inferno were honest, right? There, the gate to hell said, Lasciate ogni speranza voi che entrate. Abandon all hope, ye who enter. When the Soviets got to Auschwitz, they found a scene that is kind of in our collective memory. The over 1 million items of clothes, whole rooms filled with just human hair, tons of it, piles up to the ceiling, piles, mounds of glasses and shoes. And they also found thousands of prisoners there, incredibly still alive considering the sub-zero winter temperatures. And one of those people was my grandmother, Roja. She survived. She'd been dragged there from her home the year before with her family. They were in Hungary. And Hungary is a bitterly anti-Semitic country, really. I mean, the level with which it's okay to say anti-Semitic stuff in public, and even on TV, it's incredible to someone, brought up in England. And even Italy, the country where Mussolini still today enjoys at least begrudging admiration from a sizable chunk of society. Even in Italy, things that are acceptable in Hungary would just not be okay. And it can be anything, you'll be seeing an apartment and the landlord will be showing you the rooms and casually throwing in that the previous tenant was, a Jewish girl. And it doesn't sound quite as nice as that in Hungarian. It sounds more like a Jew girl. And there's just that smudge of mustard on it, like it's a bad thing that she was a Jew. Or, walking out of temple after my nephew's bar mitzvah, and a security guy comes up and says, guys, you better keep your skull caps off in public. It's dangerous around here. Both these things happened to me just in September, literally both in September. And imagine in 1944, before the decades of, anti-Semitism is bad that's been just hammered into us since. The Hungarian Holocaust was a particularly brutal one, and I've always thought about it in terms of, okay, this is a point where the Germans, it's late in the war, that they know they're losing, they're desperate, so they get more vicious. But more recently I've read stuff that suggests that the opposite is true. The Germans were actually slower with the Holocaust at this time in the war. Their resources were stretched, right? They were on two fronts, they were losing, they were focusing on bigger shit than, what to do with the Jews. And just a few months later, Himmler, of course, would order an end to the gassing because he wanted to use Jews as hostages in the negotiations, which at that point was seen as inevitable, with the Allies, And the Nazis had started telling, the collaborationist countries like Hungary, stop sending us your Jews, we can't deal with it right now. But apparently Hungary wasn't taking no for an answer, they insisted. So of 861,000 people in 1941 and 1944 that we can count as Jews, I looked this up on Wiki, only 255,000 survived. And that is a rate of survival of 29.6%. That's your chance of surviving in this if you were a Hungarian Jew caught up in the Holocaust in 1944. My grandmother, Roja, she was there. Her whole family was there. She survived, and her family were in the remaining 70%, I suppose. Those, though, are the people I want to be remembering today. We get these stories about our grandparents and our great-grandparents and our ancestors and just anyone who's more or less connected to our family tree. And these stories, they form the way we see those people. It forms our relationships with those people in our family, especially those we've never met. Because in those cases, it's not like you've got empirical evidence to go on. You've got maybe a photograph in lucky cases. But other than that, all you've got is the stories that tell you who this person is, what that person represents in the story of the family. It's like we all have these rich family mythologies. It's awesome. In my family mythology, my great-grandfather, Artur, he was a very cultured gentleman, very wealthy. He was a grain merchant, and he was kind, but he was tough. He'd been an officer in the Austro-Hungarian army in World War I, right? He'd been fighting alongside the Germans, which is ironic. Maybe even Hitler. It was the same army, right? And Artur, he loved the good life. He used to break away, and he used to run off to Vienna and Paris even, so he could eat snails and other non-kosher fine dining stuff. And all this under the constant disapproval of his wife, Adele, who was way more religious, so I see her as this kind of orthodox lady in the family. And of course there was Roja, my grandmother, who used to be this kid beloved by everyone, maybe a bit spoiled. She was going to school with a chauffeur. Perfect existence. And that girl, she's the one that got taken to Auschwitz. She was given wooden clogs, a thin cotton shirt for those temperatures, and she got given a tattoo, which for the rest of her life she'd always hide from view. She was ashamed of it. And she went through all that, and she made it through. Then she went back to Hungary, she married my grandpa, she had my aunt, she had my mum. She had a good life. Everyone liked her, and I'm told she liked everyone. I remember her liking me. And she was very chatty. She would never shut up. I had to get it somewhere. My dad tells me that once he was on the deathbed, he had the flu, and she sat by his side all day. And he said that she would start talking, and he'd fall asleep, and when he'd wake up, she'd still be talking. But he also said that the way he won my mother over was that every time he went to her house to pick her up, he'd bring my grandmother, Roja, a bouquet of roses as well, but always with one more rose than for my mother. She's such an Italian. Pepi, that's what I used to call her, she taught me my mother tongue, Hungarian, the language I still speak with my mother. I learned that from her. Now, don't ask me why I used to call her Pepi, by the way. That is a mystery. I don't know how you get from Roja to Pepi. But one of my earliest memories is me in my Superman suit scampering under the table to hide as she chasing me around the kitchen with a wooden spoon. That was what she used to beat me with. My mother did as well, wooden spoon. I wonder what I'd done. Though I think I have an idea, but it doesn't matter. Pepi really matters to me, and she matters to the great everything. And that's why I like talking about her on the Great Everything, because she's so central to how I view this project, which to me is ultimately all about Ulysses' injunction in the Divine Comedy, in Dante's Inferno. Yeah, Dante again, I know I need more references, but bear with me. Here Ulysses speaks to Dante and he gives him this admonition. Considerate la vostra semenza, fatti non foste a viver come bruti, ma per inseguir virtute e conoscenza. Consider your heritage. You were not made to live as beasts, but to pursue virtue and knowledge. That is the greatest mantra. That's the closest I've ever come to answering the question, what is the meaning of life to me? Virtue and knowledge. So then the question is, what is virtue to me? And to me, it's that strength, that inward strength that isn't about exerting force, but the ability to withstand, to keep it together, to just hold your ground, survive. And then, after going through the worst kind of hell imaginable, building a good, happy life where you're loved and you were loved, and it was healthy. And that's what Pepi means to me. It's a foundation of morality, and it's a simple one. Be happy. Because if Pepi could be happy after going through all that, what excuse could I possibly have? The dividing line between good and evil runs through the heart of every human being. That's a quote from Solzhenitsyn's book, The Gulag Archipelago, and it's his first-person account of the things he witnessed and experienced as a prisoner in the Soviet concentration camps in Siberia, the Gulag. And I bring it up because today is a day in which we remember, among other things, another kind of concentration camp, because it's Holocaust Memorial Day. It's a day about remembrance, about remembering one of the most horrific events in human history. And I think that at times like these, it's a useful question to ask ourselves, remember why. What are the lessons here? What lessons can we find in a Holocaust or in an Auschwitz? And I think that perhaps the most valuable lesson, to me at least, that I can look at and use as an individual in my life is that it happened, that people did that just ordinary people let that happen. And I say ordinary people because think of just the logistics, the infrastructure to get the Holocaust to work, for it to be so efficient. Think of the Sonderkommando, all these people involved, the soldiers, the police officers, bureaucrats, teachers, everyone, all doing their part, whether they knew it or not. And this is something we find it hard to get our heads round, because we don't want to believe that you or I could do or participate in something so vile, evil, right? We don't want to think that just normal people do evil things. So instead, we focus on these grand narratives where there's good and there's bad, and the bad people do the bad things, and all we have to just do is be careful that we spot the Hitlers and the Rasputins before it's too late, before they can do any damage. But that's just not how it works in real life. Real evil isn't like a fairy tale or a comic book. Real evil is ordinary. It's everyday stuff. It's banal. You've probably heard of Hannah Arendt's book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, The Banality of Evil. That's the subtitle of the book. And Hannah Arendt, who you probably know, she was a great philosopher and a political theorist who survived the Holocaust, and then she went on to write about the kind of things that make those inconceivable evils conceivable, then possible, and then reality. And there's 3 readings of hers that I always recommend and that are so relevant to our times. There's We Refugees, an essay on the sense of displacement and the loss of identity that refugees face. So that seems relevant to these past few years. Then there's The Origins of Totalitarianism, on the kinds of socio-political conditions and behaviors that give rise to, well, authoritarian regimes like Hitler's one and Stalin's one. And it's fun to look at that book and the warning signs that she describes in it and compare and contrast with what we see in our societies today. I actually did a show on this, on totalitarianism, so you can check that out if you want. It's in the episodes tab or on iTunes, etc. And then there's her maybe masterpiece called Eichmann in Jerusalem, and it really goes deep into the horrors of the normal, ordinary individual. And it shows us that evil isn't something where you need some grand villain for it to take place. All you need is the kind of ordinary behaviors that we participate in all the time. So I'll be talking about that next. Hannah Arendt's book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, is about the trial of this Nazi official, Adolf Eichmann, another Adolf. And the trial was held in the 50s in Jerusalem, and Hannah Arendt was there to chronicle the proceedings as a journalist. And one of the things she says is that this was a really political trial. It was a huge deal for the Allies, but also for the state of Israel, right? Because you had this big international trial against a Nazi taking place there in Jerusalem. And maybe because of all this political aspect, but also our own human tendency to fit everything into these grand narratives of good versus evil, they ended up making Adolf Eichmann out to be this big deal, the symbol of the evil, but also the guy most responsible for the evil in a way. They tried to pin the whole final solution on this guy, like he was making all these big decisions. And Arendt says this is a problem. This trying to typecast him, to make him out to be the evil guy. It misses the point. Because the worrying thing about Eichmann is precisely that he's not evil, that he's pretty much just a normal guy. Yeah, I mean, she says he has some real issues with empathy, but he wasn't going into this as somebody committing an evil act. He's a bureaucrat. He was following his orders. He was just trying to do a good job to find better efficiencies for his bosses, like some big corporation. He's bitching by the water cooler about the promotion he deserves but didn't get. He's just some guy doing his job. And that's what's scary. At one point, Eichmann even justifies his actions by appealing to Kant's categorical imperative, the first version of it, which is that we should only act in ways where we would want our action to be a universal law. So to him, that means obeying the law, being disciplined, doing your best. And it's hard to argue with that, because if you look at it that way, we would want people generally to follow the law, to be disciplined and to do their best. And if you see that as being good, then you can also see how Eichmann would think that if he followed those rules, he could see himself as good. But no, we say, oh, he should have known it was evil. But here's the thing, and now I'm playing devil's advocate, almost literally. The kind of social pressures, the fact that nobody else was speaking out, the fact that the consensus was that he was on the good guy's side, it makes it so easy to find rationalizations. I mean, think of this, right? The New York Times, not the most extremist publication, had to ask, is it okay to punch a Nazi? Now, I think the only reasonable answer to that is no. Obviously, violence is never okay, except in self-defense. Next question. But instead, you hear arguments. Well, Richard Spencer is a Nazi, and he spreads hate, and if you don't punch the Nazi, he'll become Hitler, and he'll start rounding up the Jews. Basically, it's all just different versions of the same argument. It's for a good cause. That's the bad guys, we're the good guys, and sure, violence is bad, but we can turn a blind eye just this once because it's for the greater good. Yeah, but who gets to decide what the greater good is, and how you get there? You? Is it the society? Well, in Eichmann's society, the greater good was the survival of the 1,000-year Reich, and the bad guys, they were the Jews. They're the guys in the way of that good cause. And of course, these are extraordinary historical times in which the Führer is trying to build a perfect world, and extraordinary times call for unpleasant measures, and it takes good, strong men to play their part and take these hard decisions in these hard times. So no matter how distasteful the bad thing we do to the Jews can seem, it's for a greater good. And the point here isn't that maybe Eichmann was right, but that you and I, we reason like this too. We can justify doing stuff that goes against our morals to achieve some greater good. But what if we're confused about what the good is? We could end up supporting all sorts of things. Kick the immigrants out. Sure, I feel bad about the good ones, but it's all for the greater good. Blow up the infidels. Of course, innocents might die, but it's for a greater good. Shut down the guy who doesn't agree with us. Sure, we believe in free speech, but this is an exception for the greater good. And all the while, you're doing all these bad things thinking you're the good guy. So how do we avoid that? How do we avoid being Eichmann? How do we ever know we're not being Eichmann? When thinking about Adolf Eichmann and the actions he took to further the Holocaust, it's pretty easy to find a whole bunch of moral and intellectual failings. But it's interesting to analyze those failings, because ultimately the point of Hannah Arendt's book about the banality of evil is that it's really easy for us to just do evil without necessarily knowing we're doing evil, right? We might be completely blinded to the harm we're causing. Or we might just look at it some different way, like Eichmann. He's saying, well, I'm a good guy. I do a good job. I follow the rules. I obey the law. I do what society tells me to do. That is good, right? Or you might know that you're doing something bad, but you'll rationalize it. It's for a greater cause. And I know this is bad, but it has to be done. It's a necessary evil. Oh, I hate that phrase. I don't think any evil is necessary. Because, you see, people are going to get hurt in the evil part of necessary evil. But the point is, she's saying, Hannah Arendt is, that it is possible, in principle, to do something bad and not knowing that you're doing something bad. You can be blind to it. And that's a conundrum, because if that's possible, how do you ever know you're not doing something bad? You're not being the bad guy. It's kind of like René Descartes' famous philosophical investigation, the part of it where he's saying, well, when you're dreaming, you don't know you're dreaming. So how do I know I'm not dreaming now? And there's no easy answers to that. But when it comes to Eichmann, you immediately see that one big failure there is a failure in critical thinking. He was completely acritical. Sure, he's saying, well, I'm following Kant's categorical imperative. He says, act in ways that you want could be universalized. And he's saying, well, I want everyone to obey the law and be good citizens and do a good job. So I do that. And in this case, that meant, participating in the Holocaust. Except he's being completely acritical, because what you don't want to universalize is for people to blindly follow the rules, to blindly obey the law. What if the law were, because some crazy maniac got into power, everyone commits suicide? Would that then be a good thing just because some guy who happened to win an election says so? Does that mean if Trump makes it a law to kick out immigrants that suddenly becomes a moral good? Of course not. We always have to apply critical thinking. We have to question what we're told. That is the basis of, well, a healthy democracy, is questioning and voicing our questions and even our dissent. Don't just accept what we're told. Never accept what society tells you is good without questioning it. Always ask it, even if you are the only person asking the question. That is enough, because you might be the only person who's right. And believe me, I actually, as arrogant as that sounds, because it is arrogant, I have been in that situation. I often am. So I guess the lesson here is always apply critical thinking. But another one of Eichmann's failings is compassion. Because had he taken just one step further into Kant's philosophy, to the second formulation of the categorical imperative, he would have found this rule: act as though humanity is an end in itself and not a means. Now that's saying that human beings are individuals. They got their own inner experience, their hopes, their dreams, their fears. We need to respect that, not use them, not as a means to our ends. We need to see everyone as the protagonist in their own story, not just bit players in our story, not just there to satisfy whatever plot development we need in our lives. This is the rule that helps us be considerate of other people, of their wants and their needs. It's also the moral justification for oral sex. So if Eichmann had followed this rule in Kant, he would have gone down on his wife more, but also he would have realized that the numbers he was moving around on paper, finding efficiencies, those were real people, deserving of compassion. He would have realized that what he was doing, it was immoral. He was causing harm. It was evil. Recognizing the humanity in others is a big step in controlling our own urges, which are sometimes violent and tribal. And it helps us realize that these terrible costs that are worth it for the good cause, all the people that are going to die in whatever noble revolution we have in mind, that's not some abstract concept. Those are real human lives that are going to be destroyed. Ignoring that is what Eichmann did. Let's not be Eichmann. But the most important thing of all is recognizing the truth in Solzhenitsyn's words, that the dividing line between good and evil really does run through the heart of every human being, of you, me, everyone. And to look, when we act, look inside our hearts, and to recognize whether what's moving us is good or evil.
The podcast you just heard was recorded with Anchor. If you want to make your own, download the Android or iOS app completely free from anchor.fm/podcast. That's anchor.fm/podcast.